Thank you all for coming. Yes, and I'm here to talk about education. I'm going to say something about education that I think many of you might find a little contentious. I hope at least some of you will disagree. Many of you will probably or possibly disagree with some elements. Some of you will hopefully find the wisdom in some of the words that I'm about to convey. Don't worry, they're not going to be all my own. I'm not saying that I have everything in terms of absolute wisdom when it comes to education, but some people, I feel, have had tremendous and great insights. Let me tell you what most people think of education when they come to me. I have a lot of students and I have a lot of parents who walk up to me and they say things like, you know what, I'd like to learn all about this. I have this subject and I'm really interested in it and I want to learn these elements of this subject. I want to learn. And it took me quite a while, but I realized that there's a fundamental difference between learning and education. Learning isn't necessarily understanding. Learning can simply be taking in information. And when I came to that realization, I thought of the words of the great poet William Butler Yeats, who once said that education is not filling up the pail, it's lighting the fire. And his words were meant to inspire, to make us aware of the fact that information is one thing, and its acquisition, though valuable, is not the point of education. Alan Bloom, the great philosopher, and every time I think of what he said about education, I find new meaning in it. Very simple words, but he said that education is essentially little more than the process or the journey of going from the darkness into the light. When I first heard that, or when I first read his words, I thought, that just simply means this whole enlightenment. I'm going to somehow get enlightened. I'm going to enlighten myself by absorbing information, acquiring it, digesting it, and then presenting it out to other people. And then I realized there's more of a metaphor to the idea of going from darkness and light than simply going from a place of ignorance to a place of enlightenment or awareness. Think about every time you hear going from darkness to light. It has so many more meanings. When we make fundamental transitions in life, we go from darkness to light. When we transition out of life, some people would argue we transition from a kind of darkness into a light or into enlightenment. And that struck me as one of the perfect definitions for what education is. What is it? It's a process. It's not simply knowing things and picking up information and taking facts and saying, all of a sudden, I understand something. Because if that's what your definition of education is, and I can say this as an educator, you are really limiting yourself. And here's how you're limiting yourself. Sure, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that learning information is bad. I'm saying it's fundamental. In fact, it's crucial. And the reason that people very often bring up that issue of, well, is education simply acquiring information? I can almost anticipate that second question after I hesitantly step back and say, yes, it can mean that. They'll quickly interject with a question, oh, that'll get me a job, won't it? Which I say, yeah, it might get you a job. It probably will get you a job. It'll get you work. But think of it this way. A job is something that somebody gives you. And if all you have in return is the ability to provide them with some information, some data, some facts, something, but not understand how those facts or things work, then eventually somebody else will just come along with a better set of data or a better ability to communicate that data, and then guess where you will be? You may be out of a job. You may be obsolete. So what is education? It's not filling the pail, it's lighting the passion. It's creating an awareness. Okay, well, why is that important? Actually reminded of Maya Angelou's words, who said, the awareness that you build through education is the ability to see value and worth. That the idea that someone may have wisdom, though that person is illiterate, may mean that that person is more educated than a university professor. And when I first read that, I was a university professor, okay. She might have been thinking of me, but I don't think so. It's that whole idea that you can cure things like illiteracy by giving a person basic tools, but you can't change the quality of the person simply by doing that. It may be a crucial first step, but it doesn't define the whole process. And Alan Bloom, the journalist, I used to work as a journalist, and I found some great wisdom in some of his words. And he once said that education had a purpose, and the purpose of education was to turn the mirror into a window. I think it was only recently that I realized what he was saying. That if you constantly look at something through a particular prism, all you might have is the limiting effect of seeing only what you're projecting into it. That's learning. Or at least that's how most people see learning. It's limited only to that. But once you take that prism and transform that mirror into a window, you can see past the barrier and understand that you've overcome a limitation. And then once you do that, you begin to overcome limitations in life. Sure, you may say to yourself, my awareness of what learning is and what education is restricted to the idea that I have to focus on gaining a certain body of knowledge by studying and memorizing. And as soon as I get that body of knowledge, what do I do? Or as soon as I understand those facts, what do I do? Or as soon as I memorize this, what do I do? And if your only answer is, I'm educated and I stop, you're back to looking in the mirror because you see no potential. You see no future. Education is important precisely because it breaks down that barrier. Why is it important? Well, so what does it do? I guess that would be the third logical question. Well, great, I now have an understanding that education may be more than the mere acquisition of knowledge, more than the mere memorization of facts, though don't get me wrong, that's important. A job is important too. I think everybody needs a job. How else do you test your skills? But what do you do beyond that? And here, this is actually, I'm really reminded now of what Nelson Mandela once said. He said, the most powerful tool we have to change the world is education. So what can you do with education that you can't do if all you have is some knowledge? If all you do is learn, but don't understand what education is, how are you limited? Well, you don't see the potential for changing the world. I just love Mandela's words, that the most powerful tool we have to change the world is education. The great psychologist Jean Piaget studied developmental psychology. He also once said that the purpose of education is not to fabricate people who simply do what past generations have done and generations before them have done, and so on and so on. It is to foster a group of people who can contribute new things. I also find that wonderful and inspiring. So what is education? It's taking what you learn and what you know and doing something creative with it that brings personal growth, sure, but is also like the person looking through the mirror, past the mirror, through the window, into the future and seeing a new vision. I'm just going to tell you about how that actually played a role in my early life and how it actually was something that kind of defined the way that I see the future. And it's only in retrospect that I actually began to understand what the person was doing. I'm going to take you all the way back to when I just graduated from high school. And I was out applying for my first job then. I'd done a lot of work in media. Well, again, student media. I'd taken a great interest in media, so in social studies classes I read about, and I hope people remember what newspapers and radio, what those things are, because I read a lot about how those things worked. And then I actually took some night classes in how to project my voice, how to be a radio personality, how to do all those things. There was an opening at one of the local stations, and so I decided to to just throw my application into the mix and see what would happen. And I got a call. I got a call from the station manager, and I went back. And the first person who talked to me just did a very pro forma checklist. Just went down the checklist and said, do you understand this? Yes, I can explain how that works. How does a newspaper report this? And I just gave him a very basic explanation. How would you handle this situation? Well, I would do this. How do you understand a radio program? How do you understand the formatting? And so I explained how I understood the formatting. He was extremely happy. He thought that was great. He said, oh, no, I'm only the first person who'll be doing the interviewing. You'll also be talking to the news director. He's got a very different style. That's what came back. It's a completely different style. So, okay, I'm sure I can answer all of his questions. So an hour later, I came back for the second part of the interview. And it was right, it was a completely different style. We sat there in almost silence for about 3 or 4 minutes. And then he looked at me and he said, I won't ask you any questions about, do you understand how this works, or do you know how this works? And I said, oh, okay. You'll give me all those answers, and I know you have that knowledge. I want to see how you work. I want to see what you can build and contribute to what we're doing here as a station. I said, oh, okay, that's good. How will I do that? Great, I'm glad you asked. Here's how we'll do it. I'm going to set up 3 interviews for you over the course of a week, and we'll take them. Each one will be about 20 minutes in length, and here's what will happen. During the course of one of those interviews, one of the people, just as the interview begins to take off, will feign some sort of insult. In other words, that person will look at you and pretend to be gravely offended by something that you've said, and they'll storm out. So, oh, okay. I said, now, you'll be left with about 18 minutes of time to fill. I want to see how you're going to fill it, because you're going to be the only one in that studio. The producer, yeah, he will be in the studio behind you recording everything, but don't look to the producer for any help. I want to see if you can construct an entire radio program. And so here's what I did. He said, we'll start next week. Great. So I went home. He gave me the name of the 3 people who were coming in, and I thought, the way that I'm going to beat this is I'm going to research each of these people, and I'm going to try and figure out the connection that these people have to the news director, and as soon as I figure out what that connection is, as soon as I figure out who that one person is, I'll know exactly who the person is, and then I'll just come in with my own prepared text, because I'll know that's the person who'll leave the interview early and leave me in this position of having to fill the airtime. I know that. I know it because I can just rely on that preparation that involves nothing more than memory. And that will be the raw talent that drags me through this rather rough situation. And then after I started researching, I found out that all of the 3 people that I'd be talking to were long, lifetime friends of the news director. So that went right out the window. I had nothing I could do. Walked in. Sure enough, with a second person, he came up and said I'd committed something that he really found very offensive, and went on for about a minute, and then just walked out of the studio, and there I was all alone. And actually what happened was, that was when I realized I had to take everything that I knew about the issue and the topic that was on the table for me, and to begin defining as much of it as I possibly could, to turn the elements of what was left, which was the basic knowledge that I had, into something that I could convey and communicate to somebody and something else. And it was at that point that I realized that what knowledge is and what education is was about dealing with other people and contributing to other people, and also making them see how they were of value. If I had something to communicate, I had to understand and empathize. And after about 10 minutes of going on and conducting my own interview with myself, I decided that I loved spending time on the air, but that I didn't need any guests. And that's the value of a real education. The ability to take something that you have as knowledge and to work it into something new. Education is about transformation. It's about building. Again, sure, knowledge is good. Learning is good. But don't think in terms of learning because I need a job and I have to work for people. Think about knowledge and think about then education as something that is not an instrument that will help you to work for people, but as something that will help you to work with people. change the world. That's what education is. Thank you.